If you've ever felt a strange pull toward nothingness, a desire to simply vanish without drama or explanation, you're not experiencing depression in the traditional sense. Carl Jung identified this as something far more profound and dangerous. This is the psychological death that precedes spiritual rebirth, and most people who experience it have no idea they're standing at the edge of the most important transformation of their lives. Jung called this the dark side of awakening, the moment when your ego realizes it must die for your true self to emerge. This sensation terrifies people because it feels like the end, but Jung discovered it's actually the beginning of what he termed individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. The question isn't whether you'll survive this void. The question is whether you'll understand what's happening before you make a terrible mistake. The problem with modern spirituality is that it sells awakening like a product on a shelf. Buy this course, follow these steps, achieve enlightenment, peace, bliss, eternal happiness. But Jung spent decades documenting the actual process of psychological awakening, and he used one word to describe it that spiritual teachers conveniently ignore: catastrophe. When consciousness expands beyond the boundaries of your constructed identity, the ego doesn't celebrate. It panics. Everything you thought you were, every belief you held about yourself, every story you told to make sense of your existence, suddenly reveals itself as fiction. The mask you've worn so long that you forgot it was a mask begins to crack and peel away. What lies beneath isn't the beautiful, authentic self that Instagram promised. It's emptiness, raw, terrifying emptiness. Jung observed this pattern in patient after patient. They would come to him describing a sensation they couldn't articulate. Not sadness exactly, not hopelessness in the conventional sense. Something stranger and more disturbing. A feeling that they were disappearing from the inside out, that the person they had always been was evaporating, leaving behind a hollow shell, going through the motions of existence. This is what Jung identified as the Nigredo, the blackening phase of alchemical transformation. Ancient alchemists weren't actually trying to turn lead into gold. They were describing psychological transformation using the language of chemistry. The Nigredo represents the death of the false self, the dissolution of everything inauthentic. To the ego, this process feels identical to actual death, because from the ego's perspective, it is death. You wake up one morning, and the life you've built feels like a costume that no longer fits. Your relationships seem hollow, constructed on agreements you no longer remember making. Your career, your goals, your daily routines all feel like elaborate performances for an audience that doesn't exist. The meaning you once extracted from these activities has evaporated overnight. You're not depressed about specific problems. You're experiencing the collapse of the entire framework that gave your life structure and purpose. This is the void Jung warned about, the space between who you were and who you're becoming. Most spiritual teachings skip over this part entirely, or minimize it with phrases like the dark night of the soul, as if it's just a brief, uncomfortable phase on the path to enlightenment. But Jung understood that people get stuck in this void for months or years. Some never escape it. They mistake the death of the ego for the death of themselves and make permanent decisions about temporary psychological states. The desire to disappear during this phase isn't metaphorical. It's visceral and constant. Not a desire to harm yourself necessarily, though it can manifest that way. More often, it's a fantasy of simply ceasing to exist, of the burden of consciousness lifting, of returning to the peace of non-being. You find yourself envying people who seem content with their unexamined lives. You wish you could go back to sleep, to return to the comfortable delusions you once inhabited. But here's what Jung discovered that most people miss. This desire to disappear is actually accurate perception being misinterpreted by the conscious mind. Something does need to disappear. The false persona you constructed, to survive your childhood, to meet others' expectations, to fit into a world that never truly accommodated your authentic nature. That persona is dying, and it should die. The tragedy is when people think they need to die along with it. Jung studied this phenomenon deeply because he experienced it himself. After his break with Freud in 1913, Jung entered what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For 6 years, he descended into psychological territories so dark and chaotic that he questioned his own sanity daily. He recorded these experiences in what would later be published as the Red Book, a document so disturbing that his family kept it private for decades after his death. During this period, Jung felt the same desire to disappear that his patients described, the sensation of his previous identity dissolving, while nothing coherent emerged to replace it. He documented feeling like he was living in 2 worlds, simultaneously: the external world, where he maintained his practice, his family, his social obligations, and an internal world of overwhelming chaos, where everything he thought he knew about himself and reality was being torn apart and reassembled in configurations he couldn't yet comprehend. Jung realized that what modern psychology would diagnose as a psychotic break was actually a sacred psychological crisis, a necessary dismantling of false consciousness that creates space for authentic selfhood to emerge. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. But this process is dangerous precisely because it feels pathological. The ego genuinely believes it's dying, because from its limited perspective, it is. The desire to not exist during awakening is the psyche's symbolic language being interpreted literally. Your unconscious mind is trying to communicate that the false self needs to die. But the conscious mind, identified with that false self, interprets this message as a desire for physical death. It's a translation error with potentially fatal consequences. Jung observed that this misinterpretation happens because Western culture has no framework for ego death. We have frameworks for physical death, with rituals and support systems. We even have frameworks for psychological suffering, with therapy and medication. But we have no cultural container for the death of identity itself. No elders who have walked this path to guide others through it. No rituals to mark the transition from false self to authentic self. So when the ego begins its dissolution, people panic. They reach for any explanation that makes sense within their existing framework. Depression, burnout, crisis. They medicate the symptoms, trying to restore the previous equilibrium. But you cannot medicate your way out of a spiritual emergency. You can only postpone it, and postponement makes the eventual breakdown more catastrophic. The most dangerous moment in this process is when the old self has died, but the new self hasn't yet been born. Jung called this the psychological vacuum, and it's where most people get stuck. They've lost their previous identity, but haven't developed a new one. They exist in liminal space, neither here nor there, and this uncertainty becomes unbearable. In this vacuum, 3 things typically happen. First, you lose your ability to perform your previous roles. The enthusiastic employee, the attentive partner, the social butterfly, whatever character you played, you suddenly can't access that performance anymore. You go through the motions, but there's no energy behind it. People notice something has changed, even if they can't articulate what. Second, you become hypersensitive to inauthenticity, both in yourself and others. Small talk becomes torture. Social performances that everyone else accepts feel grotesque. You can see the masks people wear, the games they play, the collective delusions they maintain, and you can't participate anymore. This isn't superiority, it's exhaustion. You no longer have the energy to pretend. Third, you lose interest in your previous goals and desires. The career ambitions that once motivated you seem pointless. The relationship milestones you were pursuing feel arbitrary. The future you were building toward looks like someone else's dream that you accidentally adopted. Nothing holds meaning, and meaning was the only thing making life tolerable. This is when the desire to disappear becomes overwhelming. Not because you want to die, but because existing in this in-between state feels impossible. You're too awake to go back to sleep, but not awake enough to function in your new consciousness. You're stuck in the worst possible place, aware enough to see through the illusions, but not evolved enough to create new meaning. The practical reality of this phase manifests in ways that feel pathological, but are actually developmental. You might find yourself standing in the shower, water running over you, realizing you've been motionless for 20 minutes because the simple act of washing yourself suddenly seems pointless and exhausting. Not because you're lazy or depressed in the clinical sense, but because the motivation that used to animate even basic self-care has vanished along with your previous identity. Work becomes a theater of the absurd. You sit in meetings listening to people discuss quarterly projections and strategic initiatives, and the whole performance strikes you as bizarre ritual with no substance. Everyone is pretending these arbitrary measurements matter, that the company's success or failure carries cosmic significance. You used to participate in this pretense effortlessly. Now you can barely remember your lines, and faking enthusiasm for one more hour feels like an insurmountable task. Relationships reveal their transactional foundations. That friend who always calls when they need something, but never when you do. That family member whose love comes with conditions and requirements. That partner who loves the version of you that serves their needs, but becomes uncomfortable when you stop performing that role. These dynamics were always present, but your previous identity was invested in not seeing them. Now you see everything, and the seeing is exhausting. Jung documented this phase extensively because so many of his patients got trapped here. They could see clearly that their previous life was built on illusions, but they hadn't yet developed the psychological strength to construct something authentic to replace it. They were living in two worlds simultaneously, the external world where they maintained minimal functionality, and an internal world where everything had already ended, where the person everyone knew no longer truly existed. This split creates a unique kind of suffering that Jung called the tension of opposites. You must keep showing up to your life, while simultaneously knowing that the self doing the showing up is already dead. You go to work, smile at appropriate moments, respond to emails, attend social functions, all while feeling like a ghost haunting your own existence. The performance becomes so exhausting that not existing starts to seem like the only rational solution. People in your life notice something has shifted, but they typically misinterpret what they're seeing. They think you're depressed and suggest therapy or medication. They think you're stressed and suggest vacation or self-care. They think you're going through a phase and wait for you to return to normal. None of these interpretations come close to what's actually happening. You're not broken. You're breaking through. But breakthrough looks identical to breakdown from the outside. The isolation intensifies because you cannot explain what's happening in language that makes sense to people still operating within their constructed identities. When someone asks what's wrong, what can you say? That the person they've known for years no longer exists? That you're experiencing the death of your ego while your body continues functioning? That nothing feels real anymore because you've realized everything you thought was real was actually performance and pretense? These conversations go nowhere. People offer solutions to problems you're not having. They suggest fixes for a kind of suffering they cannot comprehend because they haven't experienced it. Their well-meaning advice feels like someone trying to repair a demolished building with a paintbrush. The structure itself has collapsed. Fresh paint won't help. Jung documented how this communication breakdown compounds the isolation. You stop trying to explain. You learn to say you're fine when you're dissolving. You master the art of functional depression, maintaining external performance while internally navigating territories that have no maps. This double life drains whatever energy remains. Jung discovered that the way through this vacuum isn't to fight it or escape it, it's to surrender to it. But surrender doesn't mean giving up or accepting defeat. It means recognizing that what's dying needs to die, that the pain you're experiencing is the breaking open of the shell, not the destruction of the life inside it. The act of surrender itself is paradoxical. Your entire life has taught you that surrender equals weakness, that giving up means failure. But this psychological death cannot be fought. Resistance only prolongs the agony. The ego deploys every defense mechanism, convincing you that one more self-help book will fix this, that one more therapy session will restore equilibrium. But Jung observed that people who successfully navigate this difficult transition stop fighting, not because they've been defeated, but because they finally understand that what they've been fighting to preserve actually deserves to die. The false self served its purpose, protecting you through childhood, helping you navigate a demanding world. But survival and truly authentic living are not the same thing. The moment of true surrender often comes after complete exhaustion, after trying everything else imaginable, after meditating, vacationing, therapizing. In this exhaustion, strange clarity emerges, the realization that you don't want to go back, that returning to unconsciousness is no longer possible. You've seen too much. The veil has lifted, and there's no unseeing what consciousness has revealed to you about reality. This distinction is crucial. When a caterpillar enters the chrysalis, its body literally dissolves into liquid. If you could interview the caterpillar during this process, it would describe the sensation as death. Its entire structure is liquefying. Everything it knew as itself is disappearing. But this isn't death, it's transformation. The caterpillar's consciousness, such as it is, cannot comprehend that this dissolution is creating the conditions for flight. Your ego is the caterpillar. The void you're experiencing is the chrysalis, and the desire to disappear is the ego's panic as it realizes its current form must be abandoned. But the ego isn't you. It's a construction, a useful tool that served its purpose in getting you this far. Now it's becoming an obstacle to your further development, and it must be released. The ego will fight this release with everything it has. It will generate fear, doubt, desperation. It will convince you that without it, you are nothing. That the dissolution you're experiencing is annihilation rather than transformation. This is the ego's final defense, its attempt to maintain control over consciousness. Jung taught his patients to observe this process without identifying with it, to notice the ego's terror without believing the ego's interpretation of events, to create what he called a witnessing consciousness that can watch the dissolution of identity without being destroyed by it. This consciousness is what survives the death of the persona. It's what you actually are beneath all the roles and stories and constructed meanings. The shift from "I want to die" to "I surrender the part of me that is already dead" is the pivot point of awakening. It's the moment you stop resisting the transformation and start cooperating with it. This doesn't make the process pleasant. The dismantling of identity still hurts, but the suffering changes quality. It stops being meaningless agony and becomes purposeful labor, birth pangs instead of death throes. After the ego death, something remarkable happens. The paralysis lifts. The void that felt eternal suddenly fills with new possibility. But what emerges isn't a new ego, another constructed identity to replace the old one. What emerges is what Jung called the individuated self, a consciousness that no longer needs external validation or constructed meaning because it has accessed something deeper than ego, a direct connection to what Jung termed the self with a capital S, the totality of consciousness that includes but transcends individual identity. People who complete this process describe it similarly. The world looks the same but feels completely different. Colors seem more vivid. Simple experiences carry profound weight. The constant internal commentary that used to narrate everything falls silent. What replaces it isn't emptiness, but presence, being without needing to become, existing without needing to justify existence. The peace that arrives isn't the peace of achieved goals or resolved problems. It's the peace of no longer fighting reality, no longer trying to force life into a shape it refuses to take, no longer measuring yourself against standards you never truly agreed to. You stop asking whether you're enough, because the question itself dissolves. There's no separate self to be enough or not enough. There's just consciousness experiencing itself through this particular form. This transformation changes everything about how you move through the world. Relationships that were based on mutual performance either evolve or end. Work that provided identity rather than expression becomes impossible to continue. Goals that were actually other people's expectations lose all motivational power. But instead of this feeling like loss, it feels like liberation. Like you've been carrying a massive weight for so long that you forgot it wasn't part of your body. The desire to disappear transforms into something Jung called authentic presence. Instead of wanting to not exist, you discover you've never actually existed before. Not really. You've been performing existence, mimicking what you thought life should look like based on conditioning and fear and desperate attempts at belonging. Now you're actually here, present in your own life, without the filter of who you thought you should be. This is what Jung meant when he said, individuation is the goal of human development, not success or happiness or enlightenment as commonly understood, but the emergence of authentic selfhood that no longer needs to justify or explain or defend itself. That can simply be without apology or pretense. The bravery required for this transformation cannot be overstated. To allow yourself to dissolve without guarantee of what will remain. To surrender meaning when meaning feels like the only thing preventing chaos. To sit in the void while your entire nervous system screams that this is death. Most people cannot do it. They pull back at the last moment, reconstructing a new false self. That feels safer than the unknown. But for those who endure, who sit in the fire until the burning purifies rather than destroys, something impossible becomes possible. You become who you actually are, not who your parents needed you to be, not who society demanded, not who trauma shaped you into becoming, but the consciousness that existed before all that conditioning, now mature and integrated and ready to live authentically. The surreal mind community exists for people navigating this territory, for those experiencing the void and wondering if they're losing their minds, for those who feel the desire to disappear and need to understand that this feeling is not pathology, but transformation. This is advanced consciousness development, and it requires community with others who understand the depth of this process. Jung spent his life mapping these territories because he understood that awakening without guidance is dangerous, that the dark night of the soul claims casualties, that people need frameworks to make sense of experiences that feel like madness but are actually evolution. His work gives language to the unspeakable and context to the unbearable. If you're experiencing the desire to disappear right now, understand that you're not broken. You're breaking open. The shell must crack for the bird to emerge. The seed must die for the tree to grow. Your false self must dissolve for your authentic self to be born. This is not comfortable. It's not pretty. It's not the spiritual awakening that gets advertised on social media. But it's real. And it's necessary. And you're brave enough to endure it. Because you're still here, looking for understanding, refusing to accept easy answers that would dismiss your experience as pathology. That searching itself is evidence that something within you knows this dissolution is purposeful, even when your conscious mind cannot yet see the design. The person you were is dying. Let them die. Grieve if you need to. Honor what that version of yourself accomplished and endured. But do not cling to a corpse out of fear of emptiness. The void is not empty. It's full of potential, waiting for you to stop resisting long enough to discover what wants to emerge through you. You are not the ego that is dying. You are the consciousness witnessing the death, and that consciousness is indestructible. It existed before you built your false self, and it will exist after that false self dissolves. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the discovery that beneath all the constructed meanings and performed identities, something eternal has always been here, waiting for you to remember who you actually are. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.